Good evening, everybody. It's John here from Tutor to You, welcoming you along to another, and dare I say it, our final live stream exam clinic for A-level psychology in 2022. You've done papers 1 and 2, and you're 2 days away from paper 3. So tonight we're going to have an exam clinic. I'm joined, of course, by two very familiar faces to you, I'm sure, and in the middle of the screen, and Lara on the right-hand side. Good evening, both.
Evening, everybody.
Right, Laura, what are we going to do tonight then?
Yep, so this is really roughly about an hour session. It's an opportunity for you guys to ask myself and Anne questions about paper 3. Yeah, well, I'm going to leave it as that. What I will say, just start off saying, I know a lot of you are kind of asking about what do you predict, what do you think is going to come up, and I just want to iron a crease out there and say, no one, as you all know, we can't predict. Mm-hmm. Even going by previous questions and series, we can't predict, because if, let's say a question's been asked, determinism and free will, and you think, oh, they won't ask that again, they've asked it. If that cohort that year didn't answer it very well, or even if they did, AQA can easily ask that again. And they have been known to do that as well. So we can't predict questions. So I think channel your energy into not worrying about predicting what may or may not come up, and into more just on the advanced spec, because the advanced spec has been whittled down quite a fair bit in comparison to if you didn't have an advanced spec, you had to learn everything. So let's just try and concentrate on that. I'm going to kickstart us off. I hope that's all right, John, with you. We've got Nicholas here, who's asked, what studies do people use when the question in Issues and Debates asks to refer to a study? Nicholas, really good question. Generally speaking, when they ask you to refer to a study, usually it's a topic. That can be absolutely any topic. So it can be a topic in paper 1, 2, or even 3. So you have quite a massive remit to choose from, basically. Okay, they'll never be super specific and say, you know, refer to a study in XY topic. They'll usually say refer to a topic in your answer or refer to 2 topics in your answer. So hopefully that answers your question on that. What else have we got here? Just having a little scroll through some of your questions. So Abby, you've asked essays and research methods. Abby, I think you might have asked before about maybe how many essays or how much research methods. Anne, have you got a percentage for research methods for paper 3 off the top of your head?
I think somebody said about 10%, and I think that sounds about right.
Yeah.
It's certainly no more. There tends to be just a few research methods questions, small ones, sprinkled around.
Generally speaking, for each section there are less questions because, as you already know, that it tends to be, you know, more on the kind of extended writing kind of spectrum in terms of paper 3. So you're not going to get as many small questions, which basically means you're not going to get as many stems or research method small questions. So I would say, definitely don't forget about your research methods, because you could still get asked a question on a research methods based topic within paper 3. So in terms of amount of essays, because I know we're inevitably probably going to get that question at some point. I can't see who's asked it though. Abby, maybe you did, I'm not sure. I was just speaking to Anne about this. Worst case scenario, they're not going to do it, and they haven't done it, I'm sure. But the worst case scenario is they ask an essay in each section. So 4.
But I don't think we need 416 markers. I think they might be 8. You know,
yeah, it's not going to happen. I think if anything, it'll be maybe like a couple of 16s, and then it'll be maybe 8s, 6s, even a 10. So it's highly unlikely you're going to get 416 markers. It's unheard of, basically.
And but what I would say, no 16 marker for research methods, no long research methods questions on here.
No.
Design a study or something like that. There's a lot of questions coming up about ethical implications and socially sensitive research, and that's something that we have got some material prepared for, so we will have a little bit of a look at it later. Somebody's asked, could you be asked to compare theories? I think it was in the relationship topic. And that's something we talked about, Lara, isn't it? Because compare questions do appear on paper 3.
So there's absolutely no reason why you couldn't get a comparison question in paper 3. I know that in approaches in paper 2 they took the kind of bullet point out that said comparison of approaches, but that was specifically in there as a comparison bullet point. That's not a bullet point in any of the paper 3 topics. However, comparison is a command word that they could potentially use for an extended question or a small question. So yes, when you have multiple theories, you very well need to know how to be able to compare them in terms of pros and cons against each other would be a really useful thing. We've actually, what we might do, Anne, just because we're kind of going through it now, should we get John to go through, let's go to the comparison slide we've got on the PowerPoint in a minute. Sorry, John, just the next one.
A bit behind, it's a bit further back. Oh, there we go,
Yeah, so comparison focus here. I've just grabbed some of the comparison topic essays, extended essays that have come up in previous series. So we've got outline and compare 2 treatments for schizophrenia, outline 1 or more self-report measures of stress. Again, some of you might not do some of these topics, but it's just to illustrate the comparison command word here. So compare self-report measures of stress with physiological measures of stress, and outline and compare 2 explanations for offending, refer to evidence in your answer. Now, what I've just put at the bottom here, again, we'll put this PowerPoint up, but you might want to, kind of note some of these down, take a screenshot of it. But some comparative parameters that you might want to think about if you're thinking, God, how do I compare theories or treatments or whatever it is? These are just some points you might want to be thinking about. What about the effectiveness of it? Maybe one is more effective than the other in terms of the research. Has it got good application? Does the theory mean that we've got a really good, therapy that helps to treat a certain disorder or certain mental health disorder? Is it scientific? Think about the debates, specifically reductionism, holism. You can think about nomothetic and idiographic as well, the implications of that theory or study or treatment. So there's quite a lot there in terms of comparative parameters that you can be utilizing, if you like. If you're worrying about comparison essays, a lot of you probably, at least half of that would feel fairly confident knowing what to write, I would say, especially with, is the theory scientific, for example? Is it nomothetic or idiographic? Is it reductionist? Does it have good application to real life? So they're kind of some easy parameters to think about when we're comparing, if you like.
And comparison, somebody's asked, comparison is AO3. So the outline is your AO1 and the comparison is your AO3. Going back to the question about relationship, well, yes, you could see how you could be asked a question like outline and compare social exchange theory and equity theory. That is a potential question. That is a possibility. So it's just being aware and not, that you might get to compare questions, and just like Lara said, having some ideas about what sorts of things you can compare on. And Emma, no, you don't need to do individual evaluation points. Often when students get compare questions, that's what they do. They outline one and evaluate it, and outline the other and evaluate it, and don't actually compare anything. And you really don't want to do that, because the only marks that you can get then are the marks for the AO1. The AO3 comes from the comparisons.
J04, you've asked about, do you need to know specific ethical implications? So let's go to our ethical implications slide, because I think this is going to iron quite a lot of creases out for a lot of you guys. So if we just go back a slide, John, to ethics, the table, perfect. So Anne and I were talking before that, generally speaking, students don't feel, too confident on this, and also don't answer ethical implications questions very well. When students get a question on ethical implications, they tend to answer it using ethical issues. Now, you can see the difference here. I hope you can. Ethical issues is our kind of very much research methods ethics, if you like, deception, consent, right to draw. We know that, okay, when designing a study especially. But what you really need to be mindful of, especially with social sensitivity and implications generally, is how that kind of affects, if you like, the participants, the wider public, how the findings might be used, bias against certain people, influence on moral attitudes, economic implications. So something to think about, for example, how will the findings be used? Think about Bowlby's monotropic theory in paper 1 from attachment. The fact that he has devised this theory that states that, there's great importance for the mother and the maternal role in those first critical years with that bond, that actually what that may end up doing is it may discourage women or mothers from going back to work when maybe they feel they want to go back to work, or they feel they're ready to go back to work. And it may kind of, in a socially sensitive way, make them feel quite guilty for going back to work, and it may discourage them from going out to work and actually stay at home. So that's something to think about in terms of, how can the findings be used? Not necessarily in a good way, but how may they be used in a negative way as well, and how may they disadvantage certain groups in society as well to think about. So that's the difference there you can see between ethical implications, if you got that wording, in comparison to ethical issues.
Yeah, the implication is the effect. So Jessica, you said, is one ethical implication if a researcher publishes a study that isn't valid? Well, you need to think about what would the effects be if a researcher published a study that isn't valid. It's not so much that they did it, it's what does that cause? And those effects, like Lara said, they could be the effects on the participants. So things like, deception and participants being harmed. Obviously, it affects the participants, but then it's the effects of the wider public. So if that research is false and it's not valid, then that potentially can have effects on the wider public. if anybody's aware of the kind of research, the intelligence research by Cyril Burt, that had major implications for the educational system. So it's always, when you think implications, of what effects does it have? And that's, where ethical issues is just what is the problem. The implications are what effect does it have, and just kind of keep that straight in your head. And that's where socially sensitive research comes in, because people were asking about that. What's the difference between ethical implications and socially sensitive research? Well, socially sensitive research kind of is an ethical implication. It's research where it has an effect, not just on the participants who took part in the research, but people coming from the same social group, where it has an effect on them as well. And like Lara's just been saying about Bowlby's research, it can be deemed to be socially sensitive because it can have an effect on mothers who are made to feel guilty, because they want to go back to work. So implications, effects.
Yeah. Jasmine's just asked a good question. Can we get a straight 16 marker on ethical implications? The answer is yes.
Yes.
It is in the advanced, Jasmine.
It's in the advanced information,
There's ethical implications of research studies and theory, including reference to social sensitivity. So absolutely, you can get a 16 marker. Yes.
I was just going to say they may or may not put that including reference to social sensitivity. If they do, then it suggests that you need to include it, doesn't it? But they could just
I would say, like Anne's just mentioned with ethical implications, always mention social sensitivity regardless, because it is an ethical implication. So that if you did get a question that had referred to social sensitivity, you've covered all bases, because it is part of ethical implications anyway. So it makes sense to make sure that you're mindful of that. So you've covered both bases, if you like.
Hilda, examples from previous topics, they don't do that, do they? They just say using a topic that you've studied, or using
they won't
two
name
topics
it
that you've studied.
Yeah, they won't name it, Hilda. They'll just say refer to two other topics in your answer, and by topics they mean absolutely anything in the spec from paper 1, 2 and 3. So you have quite a big option there of what you want to include.
Yeah, Callum had one there. On issues and debates, it's disappeared. Is it a good idea to link free will and determinism to the approaches? And yeah, I mean, that is one way that you can show your knowledge of other, show your knowledge of topics, because an approach can be counted as a topic, but it could just as easily be something within, say, if you're doing forensic, you might want to link that to determinism, because forensic works quite well, doesn't it, with regard to, somebody being responsible for their criminal behaviour because our legal system deems that they are, which is the idea of free will, isn't it?
I think that also that question, Callum, that you've asked about, should you link free will determinism to approaches? It depends what you mean by that. If they've asked you to refer to topics and you decide, right, I'm going to refer to approaches, and you want to embed the approaches in your AO1, so when you outline free will and determinism as an example, so you might connect free will with humanism, you might connect biological determinism with the biological approach. So yes, you can connect it. As well as that, you can also use the approaches to support and give merit to a type of determinism or free will, if you like. So again, it really depends how you structure and write it, but yes is the simple answer to that. You can, yeah, absolutely.
This is an interesting question from Hasim Asif. How would you evaluate issues and debates? Because we used it for evaluation for everything else. And that's just a really quite good question, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a really good question, but there are some really, really nice evaluation points that you can utilise. Not only can you utilise topics to evaluate issues and debates, to give them what's the word I'm looking for, explanatory power, but you can also use concepts and ideas, such as, if we believe or side with, the idea of free will, then that goes hand in hand with our justice system, which is seen as a strength. If we say that we're biologically determined to be violent or aggressive as criminals, then that doesn't really marry up with our justice system punishing people for bad behaviour, because actually it's not their fault. They haven't decided this. It's their genes. It's their biology. So there's some really nice kind of real life discussion points you can use for a lot of the issues and debates there that you've got in your advanced spec. So I do see a point, because obviously you guys are used to using your issues and debates to evaluate all the other topics. So you're thinking, well, how do I evaluate issues and debates? So there are some really nice points. And like I said, you can evaluate issues and debates by utilising topics to give them explanatory power as well.
Yeah, and evidence to support the other side of the debate as well. So if the question is on determinism, then bringing in, evidence that free will is involved, and we do make choices and so on, and debating about different types of determinism. So it's just a different sort of evaluation. It's more discussion, I would say, rather than evaluation, to be honest. But it's different.
So we've had this question a few times. Oh, and you've just asked it. I don't know if you asked it before, but I have seen this come up a few times. What type of information would you write for AO3 on a comparison essay? Now, usually on a comparison essay, Owen, usually you'll be outlining something. So you might be outlining one of the relationship theories, quite simply, for 6 marks. And then your comparison with another theory will be like the strength of one of the theories and comparing that with the other theory. So maybe one theory is stronger than the other theory on that comparative measure. It might be the implications of it. It might be where it sits on nomothetic idiographic. So that's how you would do the comparison, and the comparison would be your AO3, would be your evaluation, if that makes sense. So with comparison, I think a really easy way to view your AO3 for comparison is to play devil's advocate. So you're taking a comparative point measure that might be it's reductionist, for example, and you'll be utilizing both of the theories, because you're comparing them, into that point. So you're kind of doing, well, this one's reductionist and that's not good because of XYZ, but this one's more holistic and that's good because XYZ. So if you like, you're kind of using both theories in the same point on the same parameter to evaluate it.
And think about similarities and differences. How are they similar and how are they different to each other? And how is one, like Lara said, how is one maybe better than the other and why? Yeah, so that's how you're comparing them. Because if you think about equity theory and social exchange theory, if you do relationships, there are some similarities between them, but there are also some key differences that may make equity theory seem better than social exchange theory.
Lavable here has asked, can we get a 16 mark on a single stage of Piaget's intellectual theory? No, very unlikely.
Very unlikely.
Yeah, you might get asked, because they are quoted in the spec, I can see the stages, you might get asked a 2 or 4 marker on a stage, but a 16 marker, mission impossible. There's just, AQA always said that if there is enough information to formulate enough information for a 16 mark, then they can ask you on it if it's quoted in the spec, but there just really isn't for one of the stages alone.
Yeah, there was something, I'm just trying to think, because there was a question a few years ago, but I can't think what the question was, and it did focus quite a bit on one of the stages, but it was the concrete operational, but that's not mentioned. Yeah, the name of the stage though. But yeah, a whole 16 marker, if it was going to be asked on one, it would be more the one where everything kind of happens, pre-operational stage. But I don't think, as the stages aren't named, I think that's I think that would be hard.
It'd be it's highly unlikely. It is what we're saying with that they'll ask it on. But
they are naming things like object permanence, conservation, egocentrism, and class inclusion. So make sure that you understand what all those key terms mean and can relate them to research and so on.
Levels to this, you've asked, would you reference Cyber and Stanley as A1? I'm assuming you mean for social sensitivity for ethical implications. You could do. You don't have to, though. Cyber and Stanley aren't necessarily names that are quoted in the spec, but as some of you may or may not know, again, you don't have to know this. Cyber and Stanley obviously have come up and elaborated and kind of expanded on what is meant by social sensitivity. So you could, levels to this, you could. Yeah, that's not a problem. For level 4 answers, are conclusions necessary for issues and debates? Yeah, it's a funny one. I've read and marked quite a few essays where students have concluded at the end. Now, I don't know what your take on this is, Anne. I would generally say that a conclusion isn't really needed. What's needed is that if it's a discuss, that you have given both sides of the argument there. So that's not necessary. You don't necessarily need to end your essays and go, in conclusion, I think. The examiner, unfortunately, isn't really interested in your personal opinion. They want to see you use evidence and how you can kind of discuss that evidence in a scientific way. So, no, really, to a conclusion, especially if it's a first-person conclusion, if you like. Anything you want to add to that, Anne?
I would agree. I would use those words to get another evaluation point in, to be honest.
Yes,
I really would. Yeah, I really would, because where essays tend to fall short, it tends to be, in terms of evaluation points. So yeah, rather than spending time writing a conclusion that is just summing up the information that you've already given, use that time, if you've got it, to include another bit of evaluation. That would be my advice.
J04, you've asked a good question here, and I just want to say double whopper burger, because J04's asked, for the idiographic nomothetic approach, debate, can you use two separate AO3 paragraphs, as one is scientific and one isn't? What I would say with that is that the scientific point is your point, and you should be discussing both idiographic and nomothetic within that point. So one's scientific and one isn't. That would count as one thoroughly discussed point, if that makes sense. So as opposed to two separate, because it's still the same point. You're discussing the element of if they're scientific or not. Fatima, you've asked, and here's our double whopper, writing frame here. So this is where you show both sides. So you show obviously the strength and the weakness. You flip it halfway through. So that's how you could structure J04. Your kind of, when you're evaluating a debate, because you need to talk about and discuss both sides there. It's not just about evaluating just idiographic. It is a debate. So you do need to discuss both idiographic and nomothetic within that point. Fatima, you've asked, can you show some examples of comparison questions for relationships and eating behaviour? The comparison questions I put up before were the comparison questions that AQA have previously asked. So if they weren't up there, they haven't actually asked any comparison ones yet for eating behaviour and relationships. Do remember, though, I don't want you to worry about that too much, because there are lots of other types of command word 60 markers they could ask. Don't get too het up on comparison. We're saying yes, it's a possibility they could ask, but it's not the only type of 60 markers that they could ask. They do like a discuss question as well. And remember, discuss is using both sides in your AO3, so strengths and weaknesses. Whereas when you have evaluate, you can be one-sided if you wanted to. You could just give 3 weaknesses. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question on that. But I think, as Anne said before, Fatima, when you've got a topic and you've got multiple theories, like multiple psychological theories, that is likely where that it could come up. You could get a comparison essay. So I guess just make sure when you've got multiple theories trying to explain the same phenomena, that you know how to compare them against each other, their strengths and weaknesses, similarities and differences as well, as Anne said.
Yeah, I'm still I think I found that question. I'm just, we said about the cognitive development. Yes, they did. In 2019, they said, describe and evaluate Piaget's research in relation to the pre-operational stage of intellectual development. So they did, somebody asked about, could it be at the level of the stage? And it was, but the focus was on the research. So it really was, so it allowed the studies. And of course, that's the stage where you've got the kind of major studies, the 3 mountain studies, the conservation experiments and things. So there was the scope. So it goes back to what you said, that they would only ask a question if there was enough information in the textbooks and so on to answer it.
With that question that Anne's just read out, and it said research, just to remind you, and I'm sure you all know this, but in case some of you don't, when you get asked a question that says outline and evaluate research into, the word research means anything. Theories, explanations, studies. In comparison to if you got outline and evaluate a research study, you would only have the option to outline the study in AO1 and then evaluate it. There is a difference there. I always say to my students that if you get the term that says research in a question, that's your get out of jail free card. Because if you've forgotten the theory, but you remember the study, put the study in. If you've forgotten the study but you remember the theory, put the theory in AA1. So you have more options when you get a question that has research in the title than if it just said a research study. Then you can only put a study in really in AA1. Yeah.
I think Ellie wants us to really answer this question. Is it likely for us to get an idiographic and nomothetic 16 marker because it's never come up? I suppose it's as likely as anything else, isn't it?
Yeah, it's likely as anything else. It is its own bullet point. It is its own debate. Of course, debates have been asked as a 16 marker. So in short, yes. We can't answer is it likely because none of us know. But, we don't know.
Be prepared that it could.
We have no idea. So we can't say.
Can't rule it out. Be thinking about how you would answer that if it was.
Abby wants this question answered, Anne. What is the scientific emphasis on causal explanations? So, as some of you already know, the scientific emphasis on causal explanations is under the free will determinism debate. Okay, now there's quite a few key terms going on there. One is scientific, and we know for something to be scientific, generally words such as objectivity, reliability, validity, cause and effect, all of these things come up for us, right? When we think about scientific. Now, in terms of causal explanations, in terms of being confident of cause and effect, this is when we control everything. We control as much as we can, and we're only manipulating the IV. And we can therefore, because we're controlling everything, we can be more sure that the DV, the outcome, has been caused by what we've manipulated, the IV. So I think there was a previous question on this, and it was about light intensity and... I can't remember what they were measuring, but it was light intensity on some cognitive task. And this question came up, I believe it was a 4-marker on, about the scientific emphasis on causal explanations. And what the examiner was looking for is for the students to identify the IV in the STEM, light intensity, because that's what was changing. The DV in the STEM, what was being measured, how they measured the cognitive task. And then in the STEM, it also said about how they controlled things and how it was like a controlled environment. So they were looking for students to identify that actually this is an example of, really good scientific emphasis on causal explanations because everything was controlled for and we can be more sure of cause and effect. So hopefully that answers your question there, Abby. And that
it is really the importance of the experimental method, isn't it? Because that's the only one of the methods that can actually tell you about cause and effect. And if it's a laboratory experiment, then you've got the increased ability to control all the other variables. So just don't be scared with it.
Want me to summarise media influences and aggression? That's a whole couple of lessons, I'm afraid. Well, I would just say
everybody's doing it. Not everybody here is doing it, are they?
With media influences for aggression, those of you that do the aggression topic, I would make sure that for all of the theories, so cognitive priming, desensitization, disinhibition, that you have research specifically for computer games, because as you know, computer games is specifically quoted in the spec. Now, obviously, computer games are a type of media. Not only is, video games, newspapers, social media, the TV, radio, that's media, but because you've got in the spec computer games, I'd make sure you've got research for each one of those, basically. In terms of summarising media influences, obviously, you need to be mindful that there's research that donates to the fact that violent media does cause aggression, and there's other research, and you need to have that, or be mindful that not all research can necessarily mean there's a cause and effect between watching violent media and causing aggression, and that's where you may come into play with evaluating the methodology of the research. A lot of it's lab-based, a lot of it's hypothetical, a lot of it is, artificial, it's not true to real life. So you're really wanting to not necessarily discuss, but I guess in a way you need to be mindful of the fact that yes, there's evidence to suggest that media influences can affect aggressive tendencies, but also the other end of the spectrum, that actually that research might be quite weak in suggesting that it causes aggression, and maybe some other research that donates to the fact that actually we can have really good pro-social video games or media influences that can cause pro-social behaviour. So you've got a bit of both sides there, basically. But yeah, you definitely need to know your 3 actual theories that are quoted in the spec. So cognitive priming, disinhibition, and desensitization, okay, is a must, because they can ask you on those specifically. So hopefully,
right,
Callum,
we're getting
answers.
this one quite a lot. Is there enough information for a 16 marker, it's Kayla, I think, on gender schema theory and what you would say for AO3? Okay, I think potentially there is enough information. AO3, I mean, the kind of best way to probably be evaluating gender schema theory is in terms of what evidence is there to support it and what evidence is there to challenge it. Personally, I think it's perhaps more likely to be an 8 marker, but you couldn't rule out that it would be 12, it would be 16. But always, a good way to evaluate explanations and theories is to present evidence, evidence that supports it and explain why it supports it, evidence that challenges it and why it challenges it. Does it have any real life applications? What are the implications? That's the way to kind of go. But I do think 16 marks on that would be quite a lot. What do you think, Lara?
Sorry, I was just busy reading the other questions there. What was the question? Sorry.
Gender schema theory. Is there enough information for a 16 marker, and what would you say for AO3?
I would say yes for a 16 marker, but I think maybe some of the other theories might be into play there with comparing or discussing with another one. Probably is a bit more, I don't know, I can't say likely, but is also an option as a essay that they may give you. But I think because you've got so many theories there into gender, that really easy evaluation would be to compare them against each other in terms of pros and cons. Yeah, absolutely. We've got a couple of questions that Scarlett and Abby asking, and I know you really want these answered, so we'll go for it. Scarlett, you're saying, could you get a features of science question? Not worded specifically, Anne, I don't think. However, you might get asked, I don't know if you could get asked if something's scientific or not, maybe. I mean, in terms of issues and debates, the scientific emphasis on causal explanations would be as close as it would get. What would you say, Anne, to that?
Does it come under research methods?
It does come under research methods, but obviously research methods could be, research methods questions could come up in paper 3, but I don't think they could be that specific and asked.
No, it would need to look to a topic, wouldn't it? Yeah.
So they wouldn't be able to ask you specifically on that, Scarlett, but you do need to know your feature of science, because it may come into a question that you might need to answer on science or evaluation or something. You won't get asked specifically on it, though. Abby's asked, is it true, I know you've asked this a lot, Abby, is it true you can only get 6 essays across the 3 papers? I definitely haven't heard of that. Maybe you have.
I'm not aware of that rule, but I have seen it discussed, but I'm not sure that it is an absolute rule. It's not written down on anything I've seen from AQA.
I've not seen it or heard from it from AQA direct, and I think, you may have heard that on the grapevine as Anne has, but unless it's come from AQA direct, I wouldn't be taking that on board necessarily. Yeah.
And by 6 essays, I presume you mean 6 16 markers, because they can certainly be more of the 8 mark short answers.
Right, what else? Theo, could it not come up on determinism, features science? It'd only be worded as it's worded in the spec, Theo, so the scientific emphasis on causal explanations for determinism and free will. So have a look at that spec wording for that, because that's how it may come up. Can you summarise interactionist approach? Mike's asked, what is that in relation to? I'm assuming that's in relation to schizophrenia. Mike?
I think it must be, because it's not in issues and debates, it's not on the advanced information. So I think it must be schizophrenia. Yeah.
So, sorry, all of the questions are coming through. I keep losing where I'm at with your questions.
Yeah,
so
we've all put in schizophrenia on that one. Yeah. So the interactionist approach is basically the idea that, genes interact with the environment. So it's the diathesis stress hypothesis. somebody, as Callum's pointed out there, the diathesis stress model, and then thinking about how that's used to explain schizophrenia. Again, I think this question has been on before, and then how it's also used to treat schizophrenia. So it's about using a combination, of biological treatments, of drug treatments in conjunction, with psychological treatments. But there definitely, there has been a question on that. That might have been 2019 as well, either 2019 or 2018. So you should be able to access those papers anyway and have a look. But basically, the interactionist approach is the diathesis stress model and the evidence to support that, and so on.
Charlotte, you've asked, do you need to name the researchers for supporting studies in AO3? No, in short. They don't down mark. You won't get minus marks for not mentioning the researchers' names. If the researcher isn't quoting the spec, you won't get asked specifically on it, as you probably already know. But what I will say is, unless the study is identifiable as that study, whichever one it is you're explaining, and if it's too generic, that might not count as kind of a high level evaluation point, if you like, because, I have read it before when marking for AQA. It's quite obvious when students have winged it and made a study up. So it does, it's really obvious. It does need to be recognisable as that study, and if it is recognisable as that study, include it. That's fine. Also, at the same time, I don't want any of you to think, I can't remember the researcher's name, but I remember the details, so I better not write about the study because I can't remember the name. No, if you know the study and you know it's good support or contradictory evidence or whatever it might be, use it, even if you don't remember the name, okay? Because if you remember it, it's probably going to be recognisable to the examiner and they're going to understand, okay, they're referring to that study. I can see they're referring to that study. So hopefully that answers your question, Charlotte.
Yalda's asked, could graphs come up in paper 3? Yes, they could. You could be asked to sketch an appropriate graph, or you could be asked to, given the graph, and asked to interpret what it's showing. So yes, you do still need, you could be asked for a graph. Make sure you take your calculators because you could get mathematical questions on paper 3. How many cognitive explanations do we need to talk about? I don't know what that question was about. In relation to what? Cognitive. If it says something like discuss cognitive explanations of, I don't know, offending behaviour or whatever it is, and it's plural, then it suggests that you need to do at least 2. If it's 1 or more, it'll say 1 or more, and it might just say 1.
A few people are saying, can we go over the sign test? I mean, you could get that. You could get the sign test, couldn't you, in one of the topics? I mean, I think it would. I don't want to say, but I don't think they would. But I mean, you could get a sign test question. The sign test, simply, if I can explain, is you will have 2 columns of data. Whatever that data is, you have 2 columns. You have a results table of raw data, and you'll almost see it as you're doing like the last column. The last column's not filled in, it's blank. And what you're doing is, if the first column of data, let's say, is bigger than the second column of data, you'll put a plus. And if it's not bigger than the second column, you put a minus. How to work out the S is it's the less frequent sign. So let's say we've got 10 participants and 6 is plus, 6 of them are plus, and 4 of them are minus. Your S sign won't be minus, your S sign will be 4, because it's the less amount of frequent signs. And in that case, there's 4 minus and 6 pluses, so S will be 4. Really simple way of kind of explaining the sign test and how to work it out. It's just basically addition and subtraction, basically. Obviously, that's a bit different when you start looking at a critical value table. Hopefully, you'll understand that you've got to read the instructions underneath the critical value table to understand if it should be equal, more than, or equal or less than. When you're comparing the calculated value, so your S that you've worked out, so S equals 4, to the critical value table that you're comparing it to. Right, let me scroll.
Yeah, I've got some I've picked up. Right, Olivia, whoever you are, if your description of Bickman was quite clear that it was Bickman, it will be absolutely fine. So please stop worrying about that. Somebody asked about if the researcher's name spelt wrong as long as it's clear what research is, that's absolutely fine. Has Lena said, will there be AO2 questions in this paper? Yes, there will be. And then Lovable, I think it was, said that asked about examiners. Yes, they are teachers or have been teachers, or they teach in higher education. They will check whether the information is relevant. Please don't worry about that, where it says credit other relevant information. Yes, they are teachers. They don't just, recruit people in shopping centres and get them to mark your exam papers. They are psychology specialists, so they will check. So please don't worry about that.
I have a question, Mike. Just quickly, based on what I've just said with the sign test, Mike, you've said, is the N value we use for the table the number of pluses and minuses, not just number of participants? The N value stands for number of participants, to put it simply. Okay, that's what the N is. So when you're looking up the critical value, how many participants is, let's say, in my example, 10, you go down to N, 10, and then you'd go across, depending on if it's one or two-tailed. And you're always looking up at 0.05 in the table, unless the examiner states otherwise. If they say look it up at 0.10 and look it up at that. But generally speaking, it's always 0.05, even if they don't say, always 0.05.
Zach, don't make up studies, please. Zach said if he can't think of any studies, should he make them up? And I said no.
Please don't. Please don't do that. You make examiners' life very, very difficult. Then they have to go and think, okay, is that study? Better look that up. Better see if that's the study. But generally speaking, examiners are quite good at knowing whether it's too generic and that you have winged it and made it up. So, yeah, it might be more of a waste of your time than ours, actually.
Leah, you might get a 1 mark multiple choice. That could happen, but it probably would only be one in the whole paper.
What else you got?
If you're blank, what are the best evaluations to fall back on? Grace May, I would say evidence to support, evidence to challenge, applications, and then any kind of issues and debates that you can think of that are relevant. If you're just struggling to think, is it scientific? That's always not a bad one.
I think the thing to remember also, just as a really kind of big piece of advice here, with the fact that paper 3 is a bit more heavier on the extended writing spectrum more, and that is to get a higher level, all of you, examiners, you really want to demonstrate to the examiner your skill. And the only way you can demonstrate the skill that's in the marking level box is to give quality evaluation, and is not to write a shopping list. And I know a lot of you know that already, but it's like, if you're going to spend time and really focus and concentrate on anything in the exam, like really hyper focus on it, your AO3, peels, double whoppers, maybe even I'd even go to the stretch of saying I only teach my students 3 evaluation points for everything. Sometimes 4, unless you're a really quick writer and you're really strong at essays and you know your stuff really, really well. I would say focus on 3 in terms of playing a bit more devil's advocate, double whoppers, and really focusing on really thoroughly discussing and expanding on each point. And always, this is another point that I always say to my students. Some of my students write a block of writing for their AO3. I know it sounds really, really kind of just silly maybe to some of you, but when you do your evaluation, leave a line space between each paragraph point, because you can visually see. I often say to my students, well, tell me where you paragraph, where are your 3 evaluation points? And they'll paragraph it, and I'll say, what can you see? And they're like, oh, I only wrote literally 2 sentences for that paragraph, for that evaluation point. I'm like, well, it's not enough, is it? So you haven't elaborated it, you haven't expanded it enough. If you leave a line space between your AO3, you can visually see, right, have I actually expanded on it enough? Is that quality evaluation, is it more likely to be quality evaluation, basically? And likelihood, if you're not, wobbling on too much and going off topic, generally speaking, the more you write and the more you expand on it, the better it will be, rather than if you left it brief and it was just a couple of sentences long. So that's just another strategy to think about for you, just to be mindful when you're writing your essays.
Okay, I've got a question from YY who keeps asking this one. If you have the question, discuss free will and determinism debate, refer to 2 topics. what topics would you refer to? Well, let's throw it over to you as students. If you had that essay, what topics might you bring in to illustrate free will, and what topics might you bring in to illustrate determinism? Just very quickly, because you're all doing issues and debates. So let's have a go. Rather than keep the questions coming, think about this question. Discuss free will and determinism. Refer to 2 topics. So what topics might you refer to? Let's help YY a little bit. Yeah, humanistic psychology could bring in for free will. Biological approach for determinism. Absolutely.
What about for environmental?
Yeah, what about environmental determinism? What could you bring in there? Still deterministic. Yeah, you could bring psychodynamics with that psychic determinism. Behaviorism, yeah, because that's deterministic. When we're talking about free will, yes, Skinner, free will is an illusion. He did, didn't he? For free will, if you're doing forensic, you could bring in that point about the legal system. So there we go. So hopefully, YY, that's helped you a little bit with some ideas of things you can bring in there.
Do you remember, guys, with determinism, there are like literally 5 quoted in the spec. You've got hard, soft, psychic, biological, environmental. Yeah, 5. So what students don't do very well is they'll say, oh, this is deterministic with everything, but they won't say what type of determinism it is. So make sure that when you're evaluating it, illustrating it in A1, whatever it is you're doing, that you're being specific with it. So use those terms.
Yeah, I'm just looking at Zoe's question because she keeps asking, is it possible they will only give you 1 risk factor for addiction as a 16 marker? Again, it's hard, isn't it? Because there are quite a lot of them. So I think it would be more likely that it would be a 1 or more. Or maybe
it's
just
really harsh
factors.
if they asked 1. I think, like Anne said, it'd be 1 more. Yeah.
You know, maybe if it was going to be 1, I think maybe it might be more as an 8 marker.
Shafina's asked for normothetic approach. What examples could you use? Pretty much, more than 90% of the approaches and the theories that you cover in psychology are normothetic. So anything that uses experiments, that uses more quantitative data, that collects a large amount of data from a large population, anything that attempts to make a general law or theory is normothetic.
Memory would be great, wouldn't it? You know, like the models of memory and the experimental evidence there. Can you talk about the limbic system? No, because remember, genetic is the genes, okay? Rather, the limbic system is brain structure. So for genetic explanations, you need to talk about it being inherited and what genes are involved and so on. If it was biological explanations, you could bring in the limbic.
Shafina's asked a really good question. Should I learn all of the issues and debates? Now, if you're one of the students that hasn't actually been taught all of the issues and debates because of the advanced spec, let's just say, at this point I'd say it's too late. So don't fret and don't start learning about it all. But if you've already been taught the issues and debates, which I'm going to put out there and say maybe a lot of you have been taught it before the advanced spec came out, then I would say be mindful of it. But what you need to know is the advanced spec. They're the most important ones. But that isn't to say that the other issues and debates that aren't in the advanced spec you can't use, because you can still use them to evaluate the topics that you're being assessed on in paper 3. So just be mindful about that. We've got what do you put for AO1 in free will that's been asked a few times. So obviously we need to define it as its generic textbook definition, but then we'd maybe for the AO1 illustrate it with an example or a topic to show the examiner your deeper depth, your knowledge, your understanding of the concept of free will. So that's what you would do for AO1. Can you talk about the limbic system when talking about genetic explanations for aggression? If the question, Aaliyah, is on genetic, you are not really talking about limbic. You're going to be focusing on MAOA. Limbic system is really more for neural explanations. So that amygdala, hippocampus, hypothalamus, that would be for neural.
If it was biological, you could include all of them.
Yes. Mike, how can you do multiple burger paragraphs if the topic only has a little bit of AO1? Well, if it's a 16 marker, you would have done at least 6 marks, 8 minutes worth of writing for AO1. So hopefully there will be enough to do more than one burger point for your AO3. But if it's like an 8 marker, let's say, and usually that split is 3 and 5, so 3 AO1, 5 AO3. Always remember, spend more time on AO3 as a rule of thumb, because it's a harder skill. It's going to take you longer anyway. Even if it is an equal split at any point, it tends to be more of a split towards AO3 in terms of points. So I would say even for an 8 marker for 5 marks, so about 6-7 minutes of writing, I would still be encouraging my students to either do a double whopper burger paragraph or 2 normal burger paragraphs for 5 marks. That's what you should, generally speaking, roughly have enough time to do. So if it's not 2 separate points, then at least a double whopper paragraph for that.
Somebody said, Kira, does the psychological explanations of eating behaviour like family system and SLT come under cognitive explanations? No. No, because they're psychodynamic. They're quite different. Cognitive explanations are, to do with, I can't think of the word that I want. Distortions, distorted body image and things like that. They're to do with the thinking process behind anorexia, not the family systems. That's quite different.
We had, can you use an approach as a topic in issues and debates? Yes, you absolutely can, Becky. You can use any of the approaches as your topic.
Can you use Milgram's research to talk about social sensitivity? It's perhaps not the best one to use, but you could talk about, he did start off with the hypothesis, are Germans different? But so in that sense, maybe it could be seen as socially sensitive, but it's not the best example that I would use for socially sensitive. I think Bowlby, for example, is better. Would you agree, Lara?
Yeah. Bowlby, I would say, well, it depends. Some students may feel more confident with Milgram than Bowlby, but I would say Bowlby for me is easier. Yeah.
What's the revolving door phenomenon? Okay. It's the way within, and somebody said, could you ask it as evaluation for biological treatments of schizophrenia? And yes, you can, because it's the way that somebody who's hospitalized is given drug treatments, discharged from hospital because their drugs, their symptoms have subsided. They think they're feeling better and they don't like the side effects of the drugs, so they stop taking them, and then they end up having to be admitted back into hospital. So it's this idea of in and out of hospital. That's where the revolving door analogy comes from. So yes, you could use that as evaluation, whoever asked it.
How to represent the answer attractively towards the examiner?
It's a good question. It's a really good question.
Make sure we can read your handwriting for one.
Yes. Oh gosh, that's so important. That is so important.
Honestly, if we can't read and decode, as it were, because that's what I feel like all the time, is try and decode handwriting. If I can't understand it or read it, or if we've got to almost like play like a puzzle guesswork of, okay, I think that word is that, and so really try, and you guys, you will know if you have not very good handwriting or understandable handwriting, because I'm sure teachers have said it at some point. So just, don't want to put added pressure on you, but just be a bit mindful of that when you're writing. Leave a bit more space. Don't bunch it up so much. Try and really accentuate your letters a bit more, just so we can understand it. But on a serious note with that, how to impress the examiner with your answer, it is about quality and the skills that we've been going through basically in all of these sessions. Okay, so really making sure that you, in your AO1 for anything, that you not only give key specialist terms, but you maybe demonstrate the concept with an example to illustrate that depth, that understanding. Your AO3, making sure that you signpost the examiner that you are evaluating, so using your top words, so a strength of, whatever the topic is, or a weakness of the topic, whatever it is. So really making sure you signpost the examiner and making sure that you really give it the quality, the elaboration, the expansion that it needs. And make sure that you do remember research studies or findings, okay? And making sure that a lot of students are pretty good at starting their pill, but they're not so good at linking it back to the question. So really, when you link it back to the question, be thinking about answering the question of, well, so what? What does this point mean? So what? This is a weakness, and what does that actually mean? What's the implication of that? What does that mean in real life? How does that limit it? What does it mean?
Yeah, and it's about, I know, if you can have a clear line of argument through your AO3 as well, that can be really, really useful. And arguments and counter arguments.
NA's asked this a lot, so I think we need to answer this. What are the AO1s for Eisenach's theory? Are you talking about the criminal personality, NA, I'm assuming? Well, obviously you need to know the 3 dimensions of the personality. And you need to explain how each of those dimensions, whether high or too low, equate to a criminal personality. That's what you need to know for your AO1.
Yeah, students often get that one mixed up with cognitive in the exam. So just make sure that you know what goes with which theory. The cognitive, I think the question's been on when it's been about cognitive explanations, and there's been quite lengthy explanations of Isaac's theory that just can't gain any credit because it's not answering the question. So make sure that you understand that they're different theories as well. Can you lose marks for bullet pointing at the end? Your exams are positively marked. It's not that we start off with 16 for an essay, say, and then we knock them off. It doesn't work like that. It works the other way around. We credit what's there. If you're just bullet pointing, then it won't gain as many marks as it was a fully written essay, but it will gain marks. So if you are really struggling to get everything in at the end, yes, it's a good idea to revert it to it, but don't do it otherwise.
Yeah, I really think carefully about bullet pointing. We had some of these questions last week in the exam clinic, and I think the line is, if you've run out of time but you've got all these ideas you want to include, okay, in that scenario, bullet point, but you're not demonstrating the skills for the higher levels if you bullet point. So it's just a shopping list. It's just content. You're not demonstrating the AO3 skills that you need to get the higher levels. So as a last,
Zach, have you seen Zach? Should I write a nice message to the examiner so they're in a better mood marking my paper? Don't, because examiners have to read it. Yeah, please don't do that. Sorry, Lara. I should have been.
It's fine. I mean, we're at time now, guys. So at this point, what are we on? We're on Tuesday. You've still got over a day at least to revise. What is it? Is it an AM or PM exam? I don't even have that written down. It's an AM exam.
Yeah,
so,
I think so. Yeah, morning,
yeah, morning's always good, I think. You can only do what you can do, and I think just remember to just keep going. Do what you're doing. Keep revising. Keep doing your best. That's all you can do at the end of the day. And really remember that it is quality and it is skills over a memory test. I know some of you disagree with that, but it's not about rote learning in a memory test. It is really about engaging with the question, and this is where students go wrong. And this literally makes a difference. Grades, literally whole grades, is reading the question, understanding the command words, and making sure that you are really tailoring your answer to the wording of the question. So slow down.
Asking really specific questions there. You've got plenty of time to go to your textbook, go to your notes, and find out the answers to your own questions. Because
and don't forget, you have a whole remit of resources for all of the questions. Some of the questions we haven't been able to answer today that are really topic specific, please go and look them up on TutorTube. There are videos, there are quizzes, there is basically a whole textbook on TutorTube of information for all of you guys. So if you're really stuck on something, go and have a look at that. But there's a whole lot of resources out there. If you're really stuck on something, you don't feel like you're fully prepared in whatever way for a particular topic, then at least you've got that. Okay.
Brilliant stuff. We have gone over the hour mark, so apologies for interrupting Anne and Lara and all the wonderful questions that have been asked tonight. I'll answer one very quickly as well, because I know it's popped up a few times, which is the little PowerPoint that Anne and Lara put together with a few other bits and bobs will be available as soon as this session finishes in a few seconds' time. On behalf of Tutor Studio, can I thank everybody who's taken part tonight in terms of all of the brilliant questions, and a big apologies, of course, for the fact that there were so many and we couldn't get round to answering them all. A wonderful job, of course, by Lara and Anne for answering those. Thank you to you two as well for going through so many of the questions, as many as we could anyway. Let's put it that way. The other thing, of course, to say on behalf of Tutor to You is just to reiterate what Lara was saying before about all of the resources that are available to you to look at in the day or so that you've got left, and of course, a massive good luck to you in your final A-level psychology exam. Brilliant stuff. So a goodbye to you all, and hope to see you again at some point in the near future. Goodbye.
Best of luck, everyone.
Hope
You've
you
got
get
this.
nice questions, the ones you want.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.